Conscient podcast. This is another one in the series from the Creative Cultural Leadership course, and I'm with Lauren, who will introduce herself in a second, tell us who she is, and we're going to talk about the question that I asked in this podcast, which is, how do the arts contribute to environmental awareness and action? And it can be either of them, but usually they're combined, because art can do both and much more. So Lauren, why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself, and then we can jump into the content.
So I am a writer, an artist, and a creative climate resilience consultant, working at the municipal level and with organizations, institutions, and individual artists to leverage the arts for climate action and to embed climate action within the arts and cultural sector, helping to get projects off the ground. For instance, right now working on a project very much inspired by Julie's Bicycle, who's our host here, for creative climate leadership, to help arts organizations and individual artists in the New England region to tackle the climate crisis, both from the carbon measurement and planning perspective, and then also from the perspective of programming and dealing with the critical themes that we as a movement are trying to.
And then you do that from, then you say you were trained as a writer or as an artist, and then you're sort of branching out to helping others as a consultant and an advisor and that kind of thing?
Yeah. So I was actually trained more as a psychologist and cognitive scientist when I was younger. Okay. That was my undergraduate degree. And I was just very interested in understanding how people worked. And I think I took that with me and morphed it into something that I wanted to be back in touch with my creative roots after my undergraduate experience. And so when I went to graduate school, I got involved in creating a literary magazine that was at the intersection of climate and the arts, because I did my master's in sustainability science. So it was this really exciting moment while I was there where the school was starting up a new school within sustainability. There was a lot of momentum around this idea of collaboration between the sciences and the arts. And we came in with this proposal that seemed to have a lot of resonance for folks at the time. And that was sort of my first introduction to how the arts can be leveraged for climate awareness, climate action. It was the creation of this magazine, this really beautiful thing that had all of these wonderful people coming together and rallying around it, and spreading, stories and ideas and images and sort of philosophy and thoughts about what that means. So my formal training is in climate action planning, at the municipal level, and I still do a lot of that work, both on the mitigation and adaptation side of things. But increasingly, I'm trying to bring in creative practice to that framework, because sometimes it can be very procedural and very sort of formulaic. And I think where communities really get engaged and really lit up is where we bring the more creative aspect into those processes that may already have a structure, but we can throw in something that's a real curveball. So, for instance, I'm currently based in Massachusetts, and I'm working on a climate action plan for the city of Medford. And as part of the process, there's a real emphasis on equity and engaging underrepresented communities, immigrant communities that don't necessarily usually have voices in these processes. And we're hosting a series of community dinners that are actually going to be partly facilitated by a local improvisational theater group. So to help with the storytelling aspect of those processes and not make it just about sort of the conventional, hello community, please give us your feedback. But getting into more of a storytelling and experience, shared experience format. Also over shared meals, which I think is another thing I can get into about another project if you're interested.
Well, sure, I'm interested in anything you have to say, because it sounds like you're doing the kind of work that needs to be done more, which is to connect the arts with other sectors and other types of activities, and there's barriers there, but you seem to be finding ways around them, or at least finding points of collaboration. So if you have other examples, go ahead.
Well, I mentioned the shared meals as a real touch point for bringing people together around these types of issues. And one other project that I've been working on recently is an evaluation of Los Angeles, the city of Los Angeles's most recent public art triennial. And this is the second time that the city of Los Angeles has done a public art triennial. It just happened back in October of 2019. And the really fascinating thing about that framework was that there was an explicit focus on sustainability. And the theme was about food, but they brought in sustainability from multiple standpoints, not only environmental, but also social. So there was this really strong emphasis on community engagement, but it was a public art triennial. So it sort of blended these three things of sustainability, community engagement, and public art in this really unique way. And some of the most transformative moments of that festival were where people were able to gather over a shared meal and share experiences or stories and interact with the artwork and learn about issues related to food and sustainability. So that's been a really fun project, learning a ton about the world of public art, which I'm very passionate about. I'm also learning to make murals and mosaics right now in my personal artistic practice, and working a lot with especially youth on sort of collaborative mural making around themes of the environment and sustainability and climate change. So it all feels connected.
Well,
you know?
it sounds great. I've been at this leadership course. We're both taking it, and there's a number of scientists, people who are coming from either social science or natural sciences, and then there are many hybrid people who naturally are connecting the dots between, and maybe don't differentiate between arts, culture, and science, because in many ways they're very connected, and it's all about life, right? Remember the indigenous
ways
people
of knowing
who spoke earlier in the conference. So.
Yeah.
I think what is interesting for this podcast is for artists to hear the experiences of others. You're a cultural worker, you have different perspectives, and to sort of not be so intimidated by the magnitude of the challenge of climate change, because personally I find it daunting, you know.
Sure.
Where do you start? What do you do? All those kinds of questions.
Yeah.
But to do really concrete things that have short-term benefits, but also long-term vision.
Yeah.
So what are your thoughts on, like, if you were to advise artists who want to be more involved one way or another in addressing issues of climate change, what do you suggest? Either they start, or they do or not do? Do you have any advice for artists?
Sure. I think you kind of got at it in the way that you framed the question. You know, it's about asking, where do I start? And maybe you don't know exactly where you want to end up yet, but if you start somewhere and you do that in a way that is curious, and you try things and you get feedback and you keep iterating and keep trying things, I think ultimately meaningful things will emerge, if not at the outset, then over time, because we're all in this constant learning process, right? So a great example of this, I think, is the Mystic Mural project in Somerville in Massachusetts. It's a project led by an artist that I've been working with closely recently. His name is David Fichter, and he's been doing this project for over 20 years now. Every summer he works with a group of youth to create a public mural, a panel of this mural that is now, I don't know, almost a mile long. That's probably an exaggeration. It spans many, many city blocks now.
A long-term piece. Yeah.
Exactly. And every summer he takes the youth out onto the river and canoeing to learn about the river ecology, to learn about how climate change is influencing the river and changing that ecology. And then based on what they've learned, the youth come up with the themes, they do preliminary drawings, and the mural gets created in this really collaborative way. And every summer it's different. It's different groups of people, the themes evolve, and I think over time he's also learned a lot about the artistic process behind creating the mural, and also just practical aspects of how you make a project like that last. So I think a lot of it is trial and error and being willing to experiment, which is something that the arts are really good at, and can be a great model for other types of climate solutions. It's just being willing to experiment and be vulnerable and take feedback and iterate.
And eventually get funding for it. And
Yeah.
I work for a funding agency where sometimes cross-sectoral work is hard to assess.
Totally.
And I'm sure that you crossed that challenge in your work of trying to find, common methodology or common values across sectors, environmental. We were talking about that this morning, the arts sector and the environmental sector. But I think that it's happening in a very accelerated way. That the common goal of having a sustainable society is forcing us to work together, but it's also, we're discovering that it's really cool.
Yeah, definitely. Way more fun at the intersection.
Though it can be complicated when you have, scientific data and then the artistic process, which can be quite... So what has been your experience in that kind of cross-sectoral world? What seems to be working, or what are some of the gaps to bring artists closer to the environmental movement and other sectors, so that they can be effective and have impact as artists? They don't need to necessarily change their work, but they need to be brought into other environments so that they can really make a contribution.
With the Public Art Triennial in Los Angeles that I was referring to, one thing that came up in feedback from artists from that experience was that many of the artists who participated had never dealt with the theme of food before, or never dealt with it through a sustainability lens before, and that call and the funding that was explicitly dedicated to those projects made it possible for them to tackle these issues in new ways. So I absolutely think you're right that sort of the funding needs to be able to reflect the need for these interdisciplinary ways of approaching these issues. I think the other thing that came to mind was this idea of collaboration between the arts and sciences in terms of trying to understand the impacts of art on cultural conversation or on public perceptions, for instance, of climate adaptation. I'm working on another project right now that is a collaboration between a researcher and a public artist, and the public artist's work is all about climate change and sea level rise in the Boston area. Her name is Carolina Aragon. She's wonderful. And the idea is to do an installation that is very evocative of sea level rise, but also of the nature-based solutions that the city of Boston is proposing to try to deal with those impacts in a more sustainable, environmentally friendly, and just like aesthetically interesting way, rather than, and honestly more effective over time, because we know that green infrastructure over its lifespan is far more cost effective than, say, building a seawall out of concrete. So this public art piece is going to really be evocative of that sea level rise, this nature-based solution, and then the research is going to ask, how does this piece influence public perceptions of climate adaptation? Does it help people understand what the city is trying to do? Does it change how they feel about it? Does it make them want to take action? And I think that that's sort of a really interesting way to think about leveraging funding from the arts and the sciences to do something interesting that both sides can learn from, but also to just make something cool and be able to learn from it.
And in your experience, have those types of projects been successful, and are we able to measure the impact qualitatively and quantitatively?
Yeah, yes and no. I think there are always challenges, right? I do think that the qualitative work is really where my heart sits, because I like talking to people and I like hearing their experiences and their stories. But of course, the quantitative work is essential, especially when you're talking about funding and making the case. I think Julie's Bicycle has really repeated that sentiment in our training so far, and I do think it's incredibly important to have that sense of accountability to our planet to be able to show that we're making a measurable difference. But at the same time, those methods have their limitations in time and space, because you don't necessarily know the long-term impacts that those experiences are going to have on people and how their lives might change as a result. And so think we just have to acknowledge that and keep the conversation going. It's not a one-time thing.
Yeah.
We can't just do one study and draw a conclusion that will persist forever. It has to be something that we continue to engage with over time and respond to.
And connect the dots. This project accomplished this one a similar project, and then start doing different types of studies and anecdotes, right? People tell stories about how an artwork changed their lives.
Exactly.
And the scientist says, it was so, this is what it did to me. And so, I agree that storytelling in different forms, formal, informal. Last thing, just your Canadian connection. I'm interested in the North-South thing. I know you're Canadian, or you're binational, or whatever.
No, I'm Canadian. I'm full Canadian. I'm an interloper in the U.S.
Okay, well, good for you. I'm interested in that because this event's taking place in Arizona, and there's 2 or 3 Canadians here. But the North-South dialogue sometimes can be difficult because we have different funding systems, but there's much in common. So I don't know what you think about that North-South dialogue. You're doing a bit of it, I guess, by living down here. But
trying to.
Any thoughts about that?
I think a lot of it comes down to the funding and the difference in funding structure in Canada, where there's sort of more robust and reliable federal level funding. And in the U.S., my sense so far, I've only lived here for 4 years now, but is really that there's a lot more reliance on individual philanthropy and sort of large private foundations to fund work, and that funding is not always consistent over time. Priorities shift pretty rapidly, and that can be sort of destabilizing when you're trying to build a movement around the climate crisis. So I think that's one thing that is definitely a meaningful difference. And I think it's one of the reasons why the Canada Council for the Arts has been able to take this issue on in a really powerful way, and we haven't seen the same response in the U.S. yet. But as I mentioned, one of the projects that I'm working on right now is to try to develop this pilot program at the state level. And as with climate action, so much of the momentum that we're seeing in the U.S. right now really starts at the local and sort of state or regional level. So hopefully that will, spark into something bigger. And
Well, I was talking with Matt from the city of Boulder, and I know the cities are talking to each other, and they have their own networks, and provinces and states probably talk to each other, and national governments can do the same. But in the room here of mostly American arts cultural workers working on climate change, we're talking about the need for networks. We're talking about the need for identification of common values. And c'est pas évident, how do you do that? How do you do that when we don't see each other that much, and there's the border and all that? But I think it's something we should think about, because the climate issue does cross all borders, and there is a need to work together like we haven't never seen. And arts and culture do have a way of bringing people together. So it's something, let's just leave it an open question in this conversation, because what we're trying to accomplish here is to develop better leaders in the field of culture and climate change. And there are a lot of open-ended questions.
Absolutely.
Like, what does it mean to be a leader? Is it a soft leader? Is it a strong leader? Is it somebody who can bring together networks? Is it somebody who can rally the troops, so to speak? But I'm interested in that question because I can see so much potential for the arts and cultural sector to play a much larger role within Canada, within the U.S., and across all those borders, including Mexico.
Well, I hope then in your conclusion to this podcast, you will speak a little bit to that, because I would love to hear your thoughts.
Well, my thoughts are still forming. I'm coming out of 20 years working at an arts council, and I've had a really I guess productive time there. But I'm moving into another phase of my life where I want to see how my knowledge and experience can be applied to the issue, and I don't know exactly how that's going to go, because I feel that what I need to do now is educate myself through these kinds of conversations, talk to people of different backgrounds, and help others understand who's doing what. And then at a certain point, each individual finds their place. They find a role. They say, well, I'm good at this. I think I can contribute here. And then one thing leads to another. So I'm in an exploratory phase myself, like catching my breath, figuring out where to go, where there is most need, and then take it from there. Anyway, Lauren, thank you very much for the conversation. It's nice to get to know you a little bit through an audio conversation. Good luck with your work.
Thank you. Thanks for the interview.
Yeah, we'll talk to you again.
Take care.